And even back then, that's what you studied in junior high was ancient history. And I'm sure like all of you, whether you went to Clay or Akron or Highland or Fulton or wherever you went, you probably hadn't seen ancient history before. And a lot of focus is on American history and then also Pennsylvania history. And I also do teach that as well. So, but I remember getting to 7th grade in ancient history and just beginning to remember just how much history was before us. So now I've been teaching at Penn State for 10 years. I was in college for over 10 years, believe it or not, studying history in various degrees. The more you study history, the more you realize the more you need to know and the more is out there. So I've been, the last number of years, I've been teaching a class at college known as Western Civilization 1. And as I tell my college students, it's cavemen to the Renaissance in 16 weeks. And then you do the second part of Western history, and that's usually the Renaissance to the present. Believe it or not, though, when I teach the modern U.S. history class, that is the most difficult class to fit all of the material in. And that's one of the basic premises of history. The closer you get to the present, the more evidence we have to determine things. In other words, if you look at the papers of George Washington, I think there's 16 volumes. If you look at the papers of Franklin Roosevelt, there's over 40 volumes. We can only imagine how many volumes will be of current presidents. So the point is, the closer you get to the present, the more history, the more evidence, the more resources there are to determine. The farther you go back in time, as historians, we become we do what we call an educated guess at Penn State. In other words, we're doing our best with the evidence that we have to try to make determinations. So I know with your class here, you started at the very ancient of times, and the evidence is very scant. So therefore, we have to take things, the evidence we have, and in many cases, in your beginning of your class, you didn't even have the written word, so it was only archaeological evidence. But historians, we couldn't live without archaeology, and archaeologists, I like to say, couldn't live without historians. So we're going to just sort of follow along on our packet that I gave you. And our title is Archaeology, Historiography, and Ancient Rome. I just want to point out, and I think we all a little bit know what archaeology is, but now historiography. Anybody want to guess what that might be? It's a big word. Bethany. Yes, it's as a discipline. In other words, historiography isn't studying a particular brand of history. If you're studying ancient Rome, that's Roman history. If you're doing Pennsylvania history, that's Pennsylvania history. Historiography is the study and the purpose and the uses of history. And remember, we use history every day. If you watch the news, if you're following what's going on with the United States and North Korea, you can't understand what's going on today if we don't look back to the 1950s and see the Korean War. So historiography is an attempt to sort of study the past by, as I said, using the evidence. And remember, the second part, and this is very important for history, history, believe it or not, changes over time. In college, every 3 to 5 years, we get a new textbook. And sometimes as a teacher, that annoys me, because that means, and maybe for our two friends up there, because we have to do new lesson plans. And you might think, well, did George Washington really change that much in the last year? Or did Julius Caesar change that much in the last year? But the key is, yes, actually the way historians interpret things over time has changed. So anytime someone is writing history, it's a product of their own time. You hear a lot in the news about biased news. Well, we're all biased. Every book that's ever been written was biased. We wouldn't write something if we didn't feel strong about it. The key in history is to try to identify bias. Then we can accept that and move on. So, but with the readings of these history, with the historiography, I guess I'm getting at, is if I was writing about the American Revolution in the 1960s, the things that were happening in America at that time would influence the way I was writing about the revolution. When history was written at one time, it was only kings and presidents and diplomats. Since the 1960s, we have done a lot more at looking what the average person, what the average mom, what the average dad has done. And now, unfortunately, in archaeology, that's also difficult, because if you remember your unit on ancient Rome, the average person, the people like us and our families, we weren't getting made into mummies so much, were we? The evidence of poor people and average people isn't always around, so we really, per se, have to dig deeper. Okay, so we're gonna just sort of follow along with our packet. So we did number one, and I just, if anyone wants to write notes, just left some spaces in there. That was the background, a little talk. So second thing is, what is archaeological science? Also, we should point out archaeology is spelled 2 different ways, which is confusing on the spell check. Okay, so how about maybe everybody just take a minute. I want everybody just to read this definition. This is directly from our Penn State archaeology website. So just there's 2 paragraphs, and then we'll talk.